Hello, friends. Today we will uncover the secret of banks, how they manage to survive wars, and sometimes even profit from them. In an old photograph from 1900, bankers smile in tailcoats and top hats. They look confident, as if they hold the world by the throat. Their safes are full of gold, papers neatly stacked in thick leather folders, stock exchanges buzzing, interest rates rising. It was the era called the Golden Age of banking. It seemed that money had finally gained unshakable stability. But even in this silence, the first ominous signals were already rustling. Behind the facades of white marble buildings lay an illusion that would soon burst, for trust in money and banks always hangs on a fragile thread. And soon it would be torn apart by wars, revolutions, and crises. The beginning of the 20th century. The banking system worked like clockwork. Dollars, pounds, francs, and marks were tied to gold. The gold standard, the anchor of trust. Any banknote promised, behind it, stood metal in the vault. In London, Paris, New York, banks looked like impregnable fortresses. Thick walls, guards, inscriptions like, "In gold we trust." People brought their savings there, believing that gold was an eternal guarantee. But the paradox was that there wasn't enough gold for everyone. Bankers knew there were more banknotes in circulation than metal in storage. But who would check? The main thing was faith. As long as people believed the system worked, banks expanded, lending to industrial giants, financing the construction of railroads, factories, ships. Europe and America plunged into financial ecstasy. Newspapers flashed with headlines, "A new age of wealth." And indeed, everything seemed cloudless. But this harmony was fragile. The richer the banks became, the louder the question sounded. What if suddenly everyone comes for gold at once? There was no answer. Banks lived on trust, like houses of cards in the wind, and already in this golden calm, shadows were ripening. The First World War was just around the corner. Millions of soldiers would demand weapons, factories, orders, governments, loans. Banks, proud only yesterday of their marble facades, would turn into the circulatory system of war. They would decide who could fight longer and who would fall sooner. The Golden Age ended as suddenly as it began. And in 1914, banks, for the first time in a long while, faced real panic. Queues at counters, depositors fleeing, government bans on exchanging banknotes. Gold, seemingly eternal, disappeared from circulation as if it had never existed. And here begins the true drama. Banks, accustomed to quiet profits, found themselves on the front line. They ceased to be quiet guardians of wealth and became weapons of war. And from this moment on, the history of banks turned into a history of survival. So the Golden Age ended at the very moment when the guns of August 1914 roared. The First World War struck Europe, and banks, only yesterday calm and majestic, suddenly found themselves at the front. They ceased to be marble fortresses of trust and turned into cannons firing loans and credit. Imagine London. At the doors of banks, queues. People in panic demand gold because they feel the world is collapsing. And what does the government do? It closes the golden window. No more exchanging banknotes for metal. Paper remained paper, while gold disappeared into underground vaults for the needs of war. The trust that had been built for decades collapsed within weeks. In Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, the same thing happened. Gold vanished, banks imposed restrictions, people lost their usual anchor of stability. But here was the paradox. Instead of collapse, a new game began. banks turned into the circulatory system of the front. They lent to governments, issued war bonds, collected money from the population. Millions of ordinary citizens gave up their savings, believing, "We will invest in victory, and after the war, the state will return everything with interest." Banks sold dreams. Colorful posters with slogans like, "Subscribe to the war loan," hung on the streets of Paris, Berlin, New York. And people came, bought bonds, thinking this would save their country. In reality, it saved the banks. Instead of fleeing depositors, they received a new stream of money. But the war dragged on too long. Millions of coffins, millions of broken lives, and along with them, millions of devalued papers. After 1918, it became clear. It was impossible to return everything promised. Germany drowned in reparations, its banks plunged into chaos. France and Britain seemed to have won, but their banking systems were drained. Only America was smiling. New York banks, modest compared to London only yesterday, suddenly became the main creditors of Europe. The dollar slowly began to push out the pound. This was the first hint. The center of the global financial system was moving across the ocean. And yet the deepest scar was left by Russia. Because it was there in 1917 that banks for the first time in history were destroyed not by crisis, not by inflation, but by revolution. And this shocked the whole world. It turned out that a bank could disappear, not because it had no money, but because it was stripped of the very right to exist. Russia in 1917, a world where banks ceased to be banks in the usual sense. At the beginning of the century, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, stood majestic buildings of private banks, their facades gleaming with columns and marble, their cashiers ringing with gold coins. Russian bankers were proud that their capital was among the fastest growing in Europe. Deposits were rising, trade expanding, credit lines connected Petersburg with Paris and London. It seemed the empire had a future. But history always tests strength precisely when everything looks stable. The February Revolution struck first. The monarchy collapsed, but banks continued to operate by inertia. Trust was already cracking. Depositors were withdrawing savings. Entrepreneurs stopped taking loans. But the real storm came in October. The Bolsheviks seized power and declared banks were instruments of oppression, and therefore they must belong to the people. The next day, the Red Guards burst into the halls of the largest banks. Weapons, shouting, vaults under guard. Bank clerks, respectable gentlemen in suits only yesterday, became enemies of the people. Private banks were liquidated by a single decree. Nationalization swept away everything: accounts, deposits, loans. People who had kept their savings there woke up poor. Everything they had turned into records on paper that no longer meant anything. For Europe, it was a shock. Banks in Berlin, London, Paris looked at Russia and realized money could be lost not only through inflation or crisis, but simply because the government decided to erase the system from the face of the earth. Millions of wealthy families, merchants, landowners, factory owners who held capital in Russian banks lost everything. Those who managed saved gold, carrying it across the border in suitcases, hiding it in Switzerland and France. The rest were left empty-handed. The revolution showed for the first time. A bank is not a fortress. Its walls, safes, and locks mean nothing if the state decides that banks no longer exist. This lesson for investors was scarier than any crisis. Money must be diversified. You can never trust only one state, one currency, one system. But this lesson few had time to learn, because just a decade later, A new catastrophe struck: the Great Depression. It didn't hit with guns and bayonets, as in Russia, but with silent queues at the doors of banks in America. People came for their money and saw only a sign: closed. America, 1929. New York sparkled with lights, skyscrapers rose higher than the clouds. The Wall Street Stock Exchange resembled a festival. Every clerk, every worker suddenly became an investor. They bought stocks, took out loans, believed that prices would rise forever. Newspapers wrote of a new era of prosperity. Banks happily poured fuel on the fire, handing out loans against stocks, investing themselves, expanding offices. It seemed that wealth had become a conveyor belt that would never stop. But on October 24, 1929, came Black Thursday. The stock market collapsed. Panic began instantly. Millions of people lost everything in a matter of days. And the first to feel the blow were the banks. They had issued too many loans to those who could no longer pay. The collateral, stocks, turned out to be worthless scraps of paper. Queues at banks grew like avalanches. People came for their savings, demanding cash. And then the terrible truth emerged. Banks did not have that much money. The system relied on trust. But when trust vanished, money evaporated. Thousands of banks closed. In small towns, families were left penniless. A farmer who had kept his money in the local bank suddenly found himself ruined, even though on paper he had a deposit. The scenes of those years are unforgettable. Men stood at the doors of banks, fists clenched. Women wept. Children clung to their fathers' hands. A sign on the door: closed. That was it. Money was gone. In the 1930s, more than 9,000 banks collapsed in the United States. The government tried to stop the chaos. President Roosevelt shut down all banks for several days, declaring a banking holiday. Only a few reopened, those who could still prove their solvency. To restore trust, a system of deposit insurance was created. For the first time, the government directly promised, even if your bank collapses, you will get part of your money back. But the scar remained. For a long time, people kept cash under mattresses, afraid to trust banks again. And once again, the ancient lesson repeated itself. Banks don't die when they have no money, but when people stop believing in them. In Rome, in revolutionary Russia, in Depression-era America, the story was always the same. But ahead lay a new storm, the Second World War. And here, banks began to play an even more ambiguous role. Some survived under bombs, others flourished in neutral countries, turning other people's blood into their own safes. The world once again plunges into war. Tanks rolled across Europe. Airplanes bombed cities. Fronts shifted every month. It would seem, what kind of banking system could exist here? But it was precisely in such times that banks became especially needed and especially vulnerable. In the occupied countries, the doors of banks opened not for depositors, but for soldiers. The Germans entered Paris, and the first place they went was the Bank of France. Gold was taken away in trainloads. In every land the army stepped into, banks became trophies. Their vaults were emptied, papers rewritten, credit lines subordinated to the new power. At the same time, islands of calm remained on the map of the world. Neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden. It was precisely there that banks turned into quiet harbors. In Switzerland during those years, gold was stored for Nazis, for the Allies, for private individuals, for anyone who wanted to hide wealth from war. In Swiss vaults accumulated what armies looted, what the rich carried out, what governments tried to save. Banks, whose walls were not falling under bombs, became the main beneficiaries of the world catastrophe. Swiss banks strengthened their reputation. Client secrecy became sacred. Gold, untouchable. And though after the war, many asked, whose gold did they actually keep? The fact remained. It was these banks that came out of the war stronger than they had entered. And what of the others? In Britain and the United States, banks turned into wartime financial factories. They issued bonds, raised funds, lent to the army. The war loan became a symbol of patriotism. People gave their money not to banks for interest, but for victory. And this saved the system. Instead of a flight of depositors, there was a flow into the treasury. In Germany, however, banks fully subordinated themselves to the state. They served the war machine, financing enterprises that built weapons. After 1945, many bankers would defend themselves at trials, but history recorded the fact. The banking system of the Third Reich was part of its strength. The Second World War once again showed an old lesson. In catastrophes, those win who remain on the sidelines. Neutral banks made their name on other people's tragedies. And that is why after 1945 the world looked at Switzerland as a symbol of reliability. But ahead awaited a new era, the Cold War. A war without cannons on Wall Street, but with far subtler weapons. Banks became instruments of ideology, the dollar versus the ruble, the West versus the East. And this time, banks determined not only the fate of money but also the fate of politics. The world was divided into two camps. On one side, the United States, on the other, the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not only about rockets and spies, it was also about banks, because it was through them that it was decided whose system would prove stronger, the dollar or the ruble. In the West, banks turned into weapons of soft power. The American Marshall Plan was essentially a giant credit operation. The U.S. allocated billions for Europe's reconstruction, but this money flowed through American banks and returned in the form of contracts, influence, and political dependence. Every factory rebuilt in West Germany or France had behind it a dollar loan. Banks in New York and London strengthened their power by giving money in exchange for promises of being allies. The USSR chose another path. Banks there were completely state-owned. Their goal was not profit, but control. The ruble was not convertible. Try to buy something abroad with it, and you would find it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Soviet banks existed in a closed system. Inside the country, they maintained an artificial stability, fixed prices, a planned economy. But outside, they looked like shadows. And here the difference became clear. Western banks grew together with the global market, learned to manage crises, built networks of branches around the world. Soviet banks remained inside the Iron Curtain, becoming more like cash desks for planned distribution than true financial institutions. But the Cold War was not just ideology. It was also a battle of sanctions. Western banks could freeze accounts, cut off credit lines, deprive a country of access to global markets. The USSR responded with barter, with oil for goods trade, with workaround schemes. But everyone understood. Whoever controls the banks controls the world. During this period, the status of the dollar as the world's currency was finally cemented. U.S. banks became the central nerve of the planet. Through them passed payments, loans, contracts. Even those who hated America were forced to use its system. And yet the dollar still had one anchor: gold. Until 1971, every bank in the world knew. For $35 you could get an ounce of metal. But this anchor was becoming heavier and heavier. America was spending too much on the Vietnam War, on the arms race, on social programs. There were more dollars than there was gold. And one day, President Nixon uttered the phrase that shook the world. As of today, we will no longer exchange dollars for gold. Thus began a new chapter, the time when money finally became a promise without backing, and banks were the first to feel what it meant to live in a world without golden chains. August 1971. A Sunday evening, President Nixon steps before the cameras and delivers a speech that would go down in history as the Nixon shock. In a calm voice, he announces, "The United States is suspending the exchange of dollars for gold." Period. Instantly, the system that had held the world together for almost 30 years collapsed in just a few minutes of television airtime. The Bretton Woods order, in which every banknote had a golden foundation, disappeared. For banks, this was a turning point. Until then, they had lived in a system where trust was built on metal. Now the metal was gone. All that remained was the state's promise. The dollar has value because we say so. Banks in Europe, Asia, Latin America looked at the U.S. and realized the world had entered the era of paper illusions. And what happened next? Inflation. In the 1970s, prices in America and Europe soared. Oil shocks, rising food costs, strikes, public discontent. For the first time, people felt that money had become slippery. Yesterday's dollar bought less than today's. For banks, this turned into a crisis of trust. Deposits lost value, loans lost meaning, interest rates leapt uncontrollably. But it was precisely during this period that the modern banking system was born. Banks realized, if there is no more gold, then the key is managing expectations. Control over inflation, the ability to work with debt, international agreements, these became their new weapons. Central banks, especially the U.S. Federal Reserve, gained power comparable to politicians. Money could now be created from thin air, and only society's faith determined its strength. Yet the world did not stand still. In the 1980s and 1990s, banks would be caught in a new whirlpool of crises. Latin America would collapse under debt. Asia would experience the crash of the Asian tigers. Russia in 1998 would declare default and drag down trust in all post-Soviet banks. These would be new lessons about how, in a world without gold, every crisis spreads faster than a virus. The 1970s had already shown that a world without gold had become fragile. But the true test for banks awaited in the 1980s and 1990s. The 1980s and 1990s became a chain of crises, and each one revealed the old truth. Banks are the heart of the economy, and when that heart beats too fast or too slow, the whole body begins to suffocate. The first blow came from Latin America. In the 1980s, the governments of Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and others borrowed left and right. Money flowed like a river. U.S. and European banks eagerly issued loans, convinced that economic growth would cover everything. But when oil and commodity prices collapsed, countries stopped paying. A debt crisis erupted. Banks in New York and London held billions in uncollectible loans on their balance sheets. A threat emerged. Not only the countries, but the banks themselves could collapse. To stop the chain reaction, the IMF and the World Bank stepped in. Their loans and debt restructurings saved the system, but the lesson was harsh. Risks that are too big always return like a boomerang. Then came Asia. The late 1990s, the Asian tigers, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, dazzled with success. Their economies were booming, banks were swimming in foreign investments. but it was all built on short-term debt. When investors began pulling money out, everything collapsed. Currencies plummeted. Banks went bankrupt. People stood in long queues at ATMs while the news announced, "The economic miracle is over." Russia added its own stroke in 1998. Default. The government refused to pay its debts. The ruble crashed. Banks froze withdrawals. People lost their savings once again. The picture resembled 1917, only instead of revolutionary squads, banks were looted by inflation and sovereign default. For global investors, these years were both a nightmare and a textbook. Banks collapsed, governments fell, millions of people were impoverished. But those who managed to diversify, who kept assets in different currencies and countries, survived. This was the lesson for the future. In a global world, a crisis in one country quickly becomes a crisis for everyone. Yet even this experience was nothing compared to what would happen in 2008. When one morning Lehman Brothers collapsed, the world understood. A banking crisis was no longer local. It was global, instantaneous, capable of paralyzing the planet in just hours. New York, the office of Lehman Brothers, one of Wall Street's oldest and most respected banks. Founded back in the 19th century, having survived wars, crises, revolutions, Lehman was considered a symbol of financial resilience. But on the morning of September 15th, a short message appeared on its doors. Bankruptcy. People in suits carried out boxes with personal belongings. Cameras captured faces full of shock and emptiness. And the whole world understood. If such a giant could fall, then any bank could. What had happened? It all began with the American dream, homes for everyone. Banks issued mortgage loans left and right, even to those who clearly could not pay. These loans were packaged into complex financial products, sold to each other, resold to investors around the world. It seemed that risk disappeared, dissolved into numbers. But risk had not disappeared. It had only piled up. When housing prices began to fall, millions of Americans stopped paying their mortgages. The financial packages stuffed with these debts lost their value. And Lehman Brothers found itself at the center of the vortex. It held too many of these toxic assets. Creditors demanded their money back, but there was none. Panic began instantly. The collapse of Lehman Brothers became the symbol of a global crisis. Because banks are tied together by thin threads, loans, investments, obligations. When one thread broke, the whole web tore. Stock markets collapsed. People lost homes. Companies shut down. Millions of jobs disappeared. It seemed the world was plunging into another depression. And once again, banks became the main culprits. They were called casinos, predators, destroyers of the economy. But in a twist of fate, banks soon became the rescued as well. Governments poured billions into them to prevent total collapse. Taxpayers paid for the mistakes of those who sat in skyscrapers. For investors, this was yet another lesson. No bank is too big to fail. And at the same time, no bank is too big not to be saved. The world saw that the banking system rested not on infallibility, but on the determination of governments to support it at any cost. But a new challenge was already on the horizon. Out of the ruins of trust in traditional banks, cryptocurrencies and fintech companies began to emerge. People dreamed of money without middlemen, without Wall Street, without central banks. Thus began a new chapter, crypto banks and digital phantoms, the 2010s. The scars of the 2008 crisis were still fresh. People still remembered how banks had collapsed while governments saved them with taxpayers' money. And at that very moment, an idea appeared that seemed like a revolution. Money without banks. In 2009, under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin was born, a digital currency that obeyed neither governments nor central banks. Its manifesto sounded like a challenge. Banks have destroyed trust. Now we need money that no one can print. And millions of people heard this call. Some saw Bitcoin as salvation from inflation. Others as a chance to get rich. Thus, the phenomenon of cryptocurrencies was born. The financial world began to change. Instead of banks with marble facades, computer networks, and algorithms, instead of vaults with gold, digital wallets. Virtual exchanges boomed with trading volumes. New crypto banks offered to store and multiply your tokens. It seemed the world was truly building an alternative system. But, as always in history, euphoria was followed by collapse. The first crypto exchanges vanished with billions of dollars of clients' funds. Crypto banks that had promised impossible interest rates turned out to be pyramids. People who had entrusted their savings to new technologies suddenly faced the same old scenario. Money disappeared. Cryptocurrencies did not abolish the main law of history. Where there is trust, there is always the risk of losing it. The irony was that crypto-anarchy quickly gave rise to new forms of centralization. Major corporations and governments entered the scene. Central banks began developing their own digital currencies. The digital dollar, the digital yuan, the digital ruble. The world was once again returning to the same point. Money as an instrument of power, only now even more transparent and controlled. Today's investor lives in a strange world. On one side, classic banks, which have survived wars, revolutions, and crises. On the other, crypto banks and digital illusions, which promise independence but collapse at the first blow. History seems to have come full circle. Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies are like the assignats of the French Revolution or Roman coins with copper cores. Different in form, but with the same problem. Trust. If it disappears, the money disappears too. And here, we approach the finale. For over a century, banks have endured wars, revolutions, defaults, and crises. They fell, rose, changed shape. But they always remained nearby. And it is precisely their history that gives investors the key lessons of survival. We have traveled through a century full of storms. Banks endured everything: world wars, revolutions, inflation, defaults, bankruptcies of giants, crypto experiments. And every time it seemed, this time it's the end. But the end never came. Banks collapsed, but the system remained. From this flow of history, several simple but harsh lessons can be drawn, lessons vital to every investor. The first lesson: diversification. In 1917, Russian banks disappeared overnight. Those who held everything in rubles lost everything. Those who had managed to move money to Europe survived. This lesson is eternal. Never trust only one currency, one country, one bank. History has no eternal fortresses. The second lesson: time is always stronger than gold. The Bretton Woods system collapsed, though it was considered unshakable. Nixon, with one decision, changed the fate of money for the whole world. An investor must remember what seems unbreakable today may crumble tomorrow. There are no eternal rules, only temporary agreements. The third lesson: banks live on trust. In the Great Depression, people rushed for their savings, and thousands of banks closed. In Germany after the war, banks lived on American loans. In 2008, Lehman collapsed because trust vanished in a matter of hours. An investor must remember balance sheet numbers mean nothing if people stop believing. The fourth lesson, crisis creates opportunities. When banks collapsed, some lost everything, but others earned fortunes. On the ruins of old systems, new empires were built. After the First World War, the dollar became stronger than the pound. After the Second World War, Switzerland strengthened its banks. After the 2008 crisis, fintech and cryptocurrencies rose. Those who didn't panic, but saw opportunity, became the winners. The fifth lesson, history repeats itself, only in new costumes. Romans clipped coins, we print paper. French assignats burned, crypto banks collapsed today. The essence is always the same: trust and control. And here is the main conclusion for investors. Banks don't die, they shed their skin. Your task is not to believe promises of eternal stability, but to see the patterns. Keep capital in different baskets. Respect gold, but remember it won't save you from everything. Watch governments, because in the end it is they who decide what money will look like tomorrow. We began this investigation with photographs of bankers from the early 20th century and ended with crypto exchanges of the 21st. 100 years of history have shown. Money is not metal, not paper, not even digits. Money is belief, and whoever can predict where belief will flow will always stay afloat. So write in the comments, what do you think? Are banks an eternal force or an eternal deception? Have you ever felt money vanish in your hands? And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this investigation. It helps me create new stories for you, even deeper and more unexpected. And now, a pause. Has the history of banks ended? No. It is only waiting for a new chapter. Because ahead lie crises we cannot yet imagine.